Paul's letter to the Ephesian church shows God's wonderful purpose for the church in this world. In chapter 1, Paul starts by saying that God, through the church, is bringing all things together in Christ. And this is speaking about Christ's kingdom. When Jesus rose from the dead, he said to the apostles in Matthew 28, all power, all authority in heaven and earth been given to me. And so he commissioned the church to go on the behalf of that authority and to disciple all nations. And so Paul is saying this in Ephesians, that through the church, through Christ's kingdom, God is gathering all things in the nations into Christ. He's renewing the world through Christ and through the gospel. And when we get to Ephesians chapter 2, there's an example of that. God is pulling down the walls through the cross of Christ. He has pulled down the walls between Jew and Gentile, and he has made us one community. And so God is raising up a community in all nations, among all people, and making us one in Christ. And then in Ephesians chapter 3, Paul says that this is the intention. He says, to the intent that through the church, God might reveal to the principalities and powers the manifold wisdom of God. So even though the church is sometimes weak and sometimes persecuted and sometimes despised, God's plan is through this despised people not considered as important by the world, God is unfolding a great eternal purpose. And he is revealing his manifold wisdom to the principalities and powers of this world. And principalities and powers means the demonic rulers that don't want God's purposes to come to pass. They will be defeated as God works through the church. But principalities and powers also means the leaders, the rulers, the governments like the Roman Empire and the oppressive rulers of this world. They will be renewed through the church. Now, as God blesses the nations. Now, as we go to the book of Corinthians, we see Paul telling us the same thing. In chapter 1, he says that God has chosen things which are not. That is, that the simple things of his church and the people in his church that are not esteemed by the world. God has chosen things that are not to bring to naught the things that are. So the powers of this world, the bringing down of oppressive powers, the image of Daniel, the statue of gold and silver and bronze and clay, representing the oppressive empires of this world, and the stone cut out without hands, smiting that image on the feet and bringing it down, that stone being Jesus and his people and the church. And Paul is saying this in Corinthians, that he is bringing to naught the things that are, the things that are esteemed by the world. They're esteemed as wonderful by the world, but they're actually oppressive. And they're actually contrary to God's kingdom and God's values. And God is bringing these things to naught, not by some mighty world event, but by using the things that are not. And that's his simple church. And so throughout the book of Corinthians, Paul is speaking about these powers that the church is bringing down. And he's actually saying that these powers aren't just in Caesar. They aren't just in these brutal world leaders like Caesar, that we have in different nations today, governments and companies and powerful economic interests that really work against people. The powers don't just work in these big entities, but they work in us, is what Paul is saying, that they actually worked in the Corinthian people and the Corinthian believers. Even though they knew Christ and were in Christ, they were allowing these powers to work in them. And he was saying to them, that the Corinthians, that while you are dividing among yourselves, one for Paul and one for Apollos, and while you are in immorality of different sorts, and while you are suing your brother to court, and while you are not caring for your brother at the communion meal, but you are letting the poor go hungry. And while you are not considering your brother of a different culture and what you eat or drink before him, but allowing him to be offended, while you are not caring for one another, you are allowing these powers of the world to have a way in your life. And these powers in the world we can ultimately call the lusts of the flesh. And so Paul is calling for us to be renewed within ourselves and the way we walk and follow Jesus. And he is saying that as we do this, we will be a light to the world, and the church will bring change and will bring renewal to the world. This is God's plan. Through something that is not, he will bring down the powers of this world and renew them and bring blessing to the nations. But it starts within us in the church. This change must come within us in simple, loving fellowship with each other in God's church and spreading that to others in the world.